Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Chapter 26. The clouds were orange in the light of the setting sun. I was driving home from work. A column of smoke was rising in the sky. I could remember that Zev had taken a bus home earlier. I had offered to let him borrow the van, but he had refused. The world shifted. I was laying on the mattress in the back of the van. I was tired and disoriented. Why was I lying back here? I flopped over and pushed the curtain between the mattress and the cab aside so that I could look out the windshield. It was dark outside. It was late. I just stared up at the dorm, at Northside. I was parked outside. But why had I gone to lie on the mattress in the back of the van when I was so close to getting into the dorm? I remembered the drive. It had been close to sundown, but now it was dark. I checked my watch. 9:48 p.m. I must have been really tired after the drive home. I had been stressed out, worried about losing my job. I guess I must have driven home from the Sentinel, then stepped into the back of the van for a nap. The world shifted again. The fire alarm blared and screeched as smoke filled the tiny dorm room. The flames were spreading greedily, consuming the rest of the wooden dresser, and from there they would attack the bed. The white paint on the wall behind the dresser had turned black. The whole building was likely to go up in flames. It would spread into the beams of the walls soon. I had to act quickly. There wasn't time to apologize. There wasn't time to think. I grabbed a black t-shirt that was laying on the floor and pressed it against my mouth to filter the smoke out of the air. I managed to take in a breath without coughing before plunging into the cloud of smoke across the room to where I knew Zev lay on the ground. The smoke stung my eyes enough to force me to close them, but I heard Zev groaning with pain and found him by feel. Ignoring the stab of guilt that plunged into my stomach, I grabbed Zev and threw him over my shoulder. I could feel him shifting his weight, weakly, helping me hold on to him. I tried to hold my breath, but I couldn't. I was coughing. The shirt over my mouth wasn't doing enough to filter the smoke from my breaths. I didn't understand how this had happened. How could I have done this? It was impossible. But I was sure it was me. I had seen the flames leaping out of my hands. No time to dwell on it. I have to get us out of here. I ran toward the door, flung it open, then slammed it closed behind me. I saw Mel standing in the hallway, looking alarmed. I wanted to tell her to run, that there was a fire and she had to get out, but all I could do was cough and wheeze as my lungs filled themselves with the comparatively cleaner air in the hallway. Mel seemed to understand me, even though I hadn't managed any words. She rushed on ahead of me toward the staircase. She held open the door as I carried Zev into the stairwell and down. There were others in the stairwell, also running down. I was slower than they were, burdened as I was. People were jostling past me, and I was struggling to keep my grip on Zev and to keep my balance as I made my way down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I had to throw my empty shoulder against the door to keep it open. I heard voices shouting in the hallway behind me. "It's not a drill! Can't you smell the smoke?" Just barely managing to keep my balance, I stumbled out into the night. A crowd of people had gathered on the lawn, about 50 feet away from the building. But ahead of them stood a gray-haired woman, her ponytail sticking out of the back of a baseball cap, the silver crucifix around her neck gleaming in the dimness. I hadn't seen Val since I had left work earlier that day, but I knew somehow that she would know what to do. I ran toward her. The vision exploded into my mind, and as it seared itself into me, I realized that it was a memory, another recollection I had buried, like the memory of the scarecrow that had attacked me when I was a girl. But it didn't make sense. If these visions were memories, which version of the night of the fire and the drive home from work had really happened? I could now remember 3 versions of that drive. The first, the one I had thought was true for the longest, was when I was driving home and saw the building on fire. I had arrived and then gotten dizzy or something. I thought I had taken some pictures, but I hadn't looked at them since. I felt something hit the back of my head, and then I woke up in the school's infirmary. Now there were the two new memories. One of them included another version of the drive home, but this time no fire. I drove home around sunset and then woke up inside my van to discover that hours had already passed. The clock said it was 9:48, and I told myself that I must have been tired and taken a nap on the mattress in the back of the van, although I had no memory of actually doing so. And then there was the version that started with Val driving me home. In this version of the memory, I lent Zev the van. He had already finished his work for the day and needed to get to class. He said he could take the bus, but I told him to just take the van, and that he could come pick me up later. It wasn't that far from the Sentinel to campus. But before I texted Zev to tell him I was ready, Val had offered to drive me. I could remember stepping inside her car. She said she wanted to talk to me, that she needed help with something, that I needed to trust her. But then the memory cut off. That was terrifying. It was yet another revelation of the failure of my mind to know what had really been happening. I had never realized how easy it was for me to deceive myself. I wanted to forget what was happening in front of me and to start searching my mind for more missing pieces. I wanted to know what was real and what wasn't, and I hated feeling like I couldn't trust myself to know the difference. But it was hard to focus. The hot knife was still twisting in my arm. And despite all of that, I knew I had to pay attention to what was happening now. I couldn't spare much time for all the questions these new memories were raising, if I could even trust them. I became aware that I was laying on my back on the ground, shaking from the experience I had just had. I blinked my eyes open. My vision was fuzzy at first, but I could tell that Val was there, those familiar, bright green eyes in that unfamiliar face. Her shirt was gone. The silver crucifix around her neck was dangling over me. Val was wearing a black bra, and I could see the pale, smooth skin of her navel. The strange youth of her body on display, at once beautiful and disturbing. Her skin was impossibly perfect, with no scars, stretch marks, or any of the other normal textures that skin ought to have. She was unnatural. I felt Val's hands on my arm and groaned as pain lanced up from the fractured bone. "Shh," Val whispered. And the pain was gone. Val continued manipulating my arm, slowly and gently moving it into a makeshift sling. I abruptly realized what had happened to Val's shirt. The sling was already tied behind my neck, and even lying down, it held my hurt arm close against my body securely. And the sudden relief from the horrible pain was practically a narcotic, it felt so good. I could feel the warm presence, Val's mind acting as the most effective painkiller I had ever experienced. It was hard to be upset about that, even though it was a violation. Val was forcing my mind to experience a version of reality that she dictated. How often had she done this to me before? What role had she played in the memories I was still uncovering? I was again tempted to turn my mind inward. But Zev was standing a few feet away, his expression torn. I had to be here. I had to stay present until I knew that Zev was okay, and I had to be ready in case he needed me. Zev looked like he was worried about me, but afraid to come any closer. He was still shirtless himself, but with several lengths of bandages taped to his chest. The skin of his torso was just as flawless as Val's. "What are you doing to her?" Zev demanded. "I'm taking her pain away." "Stop it!" "I'm sparing her unnecessary suffering." "You're invading her mind." Val turned toward me. "Eliza, tell the truth. Do you want the pain back?" I felt an overwhelming urge to speak. Part of me was disturbed by the fact that I could tell that Val was exerting control over me, over my desires. I wanted nothing more in that moment than to express myself as I had been bidden. Distantly, I felt a rebellious twinge of pain in my arm. "No," I said. The words tumbled out of me in a rush. "I don't want the pain back." It felt good to say those words, as if I was fulfilling my life's entire purpose. When my mouth was finished moving, I laid my head back on the floor, filled with satisfaction. "She's making you say that," Zev said. I turned my head to look at him without lifting it, still letting it rest on the strangely comfortable hardness of the concrete. Zev's brown eyes were staring at me, his expression grim. No joy in those eyes, no mirth. I felt another twinge of pain. "I asked her to tell the truth," Val said. "You heard me. You heard her. I'm helping her." Zev rounded on Val. "I know what you've done!" he shouted. The tone of the conversation was already heated, but the sudden volume was jarring. "I saw it!" Zev went on. "Through their eyes! I don't know what you think you know, but I've seen the last moments of every single person you've killed." Val started shaking her head jerkily. "No," Val whispered. "No one can reach beyond the veil." "I felt what it was like to die." Zev's hands balled into fists, and his mouth twisted with anger. "Did you know that your thoughts started bleeding into theirs at the end? That they all felt the pleasure you experienced when you ripped the life out of them?" I gasped as the pain in my arm flared again, but only for a moment. The warm presence in my mind quickly rushed down to my arm, soothing the pain. Part of me wanted to fight against the warmth, but it was like a huge, heated mattress fell on me, pressing me to the ground. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I was securely locked in a very comfortable prison, blissfully entranced, so that all I could do was lie there watching and listening to what was happening, detached, as if it was all just part of a television show that I didn't particularly care about. You're being deceived. There was a demon inside you. These things you thought you saw, the demon lied to you." Fury exploded into Zev, and he raised one shaking fist as he roared out, "I heard your thoughts! I felt them, as if it was happening to me!" Val was still shaking her head. She was muttering, too quietly for me to hear. Zev bared his teeth and glared at her, but he was done shouting. His voice was a frozen knife as he continued talking over Val. "Your first killing was in self-defense. He couldn't believe what was happening to him, not until it was over. You were disturbed by how good it felt, and how it strengthened and invigorated you. In those last moments, you abruptly understood why he had done those horrible things. Whatever you think you know, the second person whose life you ripped out was at your mercy. You wanted to stop her from killing, not only you, but also anyone else. You could have ended her life with a knife or a gun, but you craved that feeling, that pleasure, that power." "And I swore I would never do it again," Val interjected, her voice a little steadier. I stopped for so long, I started aging again." "Shut up!" Zev snapped. His voice was blazing hot before icing over again as he continued. "The third time you killed someone, that was when you crossed the line." I managed to start paying more attention, to start really listening to what Zev was saying. It still felt like his words were distant and disconnected from me, but I knew what he was saying was important. Not to me, maybe, but to someone I couldn't quite remember just now. "You killed Angela!" Zev screamed. Val was still shaking her head. Her right hand was still resting very gently on my arm, where it had been touching me as she helped me into the sling. But her left arm was grasping the silver crucifix around her neck, turning it over and over in her fingers. Zev didn't leave the silence open for long. "Despite what everyone thought, Angela was a good person, and you knew she was well-intentioned. You were thinking about it when she was dying. She heard you telling yourself that she was just some slut, that she had wasted her life, that it was her own fault you were doing this to her. She deserved it because of what she did to Eliza." White-hot pain exploded into me. It started in my arm, but it quickly spread to cover my whole body. I was on fire. I could feel my flesh crackling and burning. I was dying. It was more pain than I had ever experienced. I was in a firestorm of screaming nerve endings. I had a vague understanding that it was my face, my chest, and my stomach that were on fire, but the pain was so excruciating that I felt it with every part of my body. Everything was burning. Every second was an eternity of agony. The pain was literally insanity-inducing. I was sure that it was burning away my mind, consuming my thoughts as my body roasted. I knew that it was only a memory of pain, but even the shadow of it made me scream. The burning pain ripped through another curtain in my mind, and then another, shredding through them like they were tissue paper. Other memories started pouring back into me, searing me with their own intensity, but I turned my attention to them gratefully, anything to take me away from the horribly vivid memory of being burned. The world shifted. Val was talking to me, telling me to calm down, but I couldn't. Zev was hurt, and it was because of me. He was slumped over in the grass, apparently asleep, and covered in burns. I stared down at my hands like they were bombs. There was a rustling in the bushes behind us. I was too on edge, too terrified. I spun around, but as I turned, more fire leapt from my hands. I tried to scream a warning, but it was too late. A lash of fire flashed over at Mel. She was only barely able to throw her arm up in front of her body before it hit her. I saw Mel fall to her knees, screaming and crying. Oh God, why was this happening? Why? Val was shouting in my ear, something about sleep. I could barely hear her. Everything was spinning. I lost my balance and started to fall back. I felt my head slam onto the ground. The world shifted. A woman was standing in front of me, pale, with long hair dyed a vibrant shade of purple. A tight-fitting black tank top stretched over breasts that were large enough to make me suspect that they might exist in defiance of what nature had intended for her slender frame. And she was holding a dancing flame in her hand. I stared at the flame in shock. I knew I had to stay calm, but how could I? It was impossible. This couldn't be happening. I'm warning you, the woman said. Call off your attack dog, now. A slender man with a ridiculous cowboy hat bearing a silver star was slowly walking towards her. I had to stay calm, but I couldn't. That flame in her hand was shattering my whole concept of reality. I know he's only doing this because you're controlling him, the woman said. Back off, now. I didn't understand why the woman was looking at me, yelling at me. All I could do was to continue staring at the flame floating in her hand. I couldn't believe it. I started shaking my head at the fire, at the fact that it existed. Have it your way, then, the woman shouted. Flames leapt toward me. Everything was pain and agony. The world shifted. Since when do you keep secrets? Zev demanded. We were standing in his dorm room. Zev was holding his phone up, facing the screen at me. The light in the room was as bright as it always was, but it somehow seemed dim compared to the light that was shining out of Zev's phone screen. It was way, way too bright, bright as the sun. I was shaking my head. I didn't like this. I didn't want to talk about this. I didn't know why, but I was utterly desperate to change the subject. I don't feel good, I said. What the hell? Zev said, but then he brushed past and continued pressing. Look, Eliza, I trust you. I just want to know what happened. I haven't heard from Angela in weeks, and then she sends me this and asks me what I know about you. I don't feel good, I repeated. I turned away from him, away from the glaring, piercing light from his phone that was making my head hurt. I felt like I was about to throw up. Listen, Angela said she might be in trouble. She's not answering. I just want to know what happened. Zev advanced on me, moving into the direction I had turned and trying to blind me with that piercing light that was emanating from his phone. I groaned and closed my eyes. I could barely understand what Zev was saying. Along with the nausea, I could feel a burning sensation in my chest, like the worst acid reflux I had ever had. Please stop. I don't know what you're talking about. Bullshit! I have the damn picture right here! I had to make him stop. Zev was hurting me, and I couldn't take it anymore. I raised my hands. All I meant to do was shove him back. He was standing too close. I didn't want to hurt him. I just needed some space. I couldn't breathe. I thrust my hands at Zev, and a burst of fire erupted from my outstretched fingers. Zev fell back, screaming in pain. Fire continued pouring out of my fingers as I stared in disbelief. The flames didn't stop coming until I screamed. The world shifted. I was screaming and crying. Only I was aware that just one of my eyes was still intact enough to cry. I knew the flames were gone, but the burns were still searing my nerve endings. I couldn't see out of my left eye. It was cooked. My right eye would have to shed the tears alone. I heard Val's voice dripping with anger. "You're going to pay for what you did to her." She was standing over the purple-haired woman, who was kneeling on the ground. Val's hand was on the woman's forehead. I felt Val's other hand come to rest on my shoulder. With my one good eye, I saw the light go out of the woman's eyes. She crumpled to the ground. The world shifted. I was rushing away from the burning building, stumbling forward as fast as I could while carrying Zev on my shoulder toward the crowd of people on the lawn and toward the gray-haired woman with the baseball cap standing in front of them. That was when Zev started cackling in my ear. "I can't believe it!" Zev laughed again, but his voice sounded wrong, not like himself. Distracted, I came to a stop about 10 feet away from Val. She was walking toward me, too. "What unbelievable fortune!" Zev crowed. That was when my shirt suddenly tightened against my body, so tight that it squeezed the air out of my lungs. Another invisible hand joined the first, seizing my collar, pulling it against my neck and choking me. I would have dropped Zev, but the long sleeves of the shirt bound my arms into place, holding him securely even as the neck of the shirt choked me. My arms were trying to flail, but were locked tight in their sleeves. I stumbled and would have fallen, but my shirt held me up. A moment later, it pulled me up off of my feet and into the air. My legs kicked out frantically. I couldn't breathe. But there was no one to kick, and I couldn't move my arms. I had no way to attack the shirt that had started choking me, seemingly of its own volition. I struggled, twisting my hands, trying to move my arms so that I could reach up to the collar of my shirt and pull it off of my neck. But my shirt had become a straitjacket, locking my arms around Zev's body, holding him up in the air with me. I had risen a good 5 feet in the air now. I could see the crowd of people that had run out of the burning building staring blankly up at me. They couldn't believe their eyes. I choked, making a quiet groaning sound. I couldn't get enough air to speak. That was when the shirt that held me in the air suddenly whipped me backwards towards the woods behind Northside. Zev and I were thrown to the ground. But the grip of my collar around my neck had not loosened. I was choking, gasping. My vision started going gray. I thought maybe I was sucking in a tiny amount of air, but it wasn't enough to matter. It wasn't enough for me to remain conscious much longer. Zev's voice cackled in my ear. I couldn't understand what it was saying. I could hear movement crashing through the forest behind me. Someone was coming. The world shifted. I was laying on the hard concrete. The horrible pain was fading. I could feel my left eye shifting in its socket, and then, suddenly, I could see out of it again. It was cloudy at first, but slowly becoming clear. I felt like my brain was paralyzed. I was sure that none of this could be real. "Go to sleep, Eliza," a comforting voice said. "You're going to be fine. Just go to sleep." The world shifted. "I don't understand," I mumbled. "What happened? Where am I?" A woman's voice whispered in my ear, warm and motherly. "Just tell me what you remember." You were driving me home, and then I don't know." "Shh, it's okay. Just go back to sleep." The world shifted. Another flash of memory. The world shifted. Again and again. It came to me as flashes, lacking all context, but as the flashes continued, I started putting it together. Until, finally, the flashes stopped, and I had all the pieces I needed. I finally knew what had happened the night of the fire. Chapter 27. The memories poured into me, and to my great relief, I felt like I could tell which ones were real and which ones were daydreams that I had conjured and grasped onto in an effort to cling onto the idea of a rational, mundane world. The true memories were sharper, more distinct. And I finally knew what had happened. I had lent the van to Zev the night of the fire. Val had offered to drive me home. Val had heard that Angela Miller was planning on putting on an impossible magic act and telling everyone who cared to listen that she could perform real magic. Val knew that there were immortal monsters out there who would hear that news like sharks smelling blood in the water. If one immortal happened upon Riverside, Val had a good chance of staying hidden. If a whole gang of immortals descended on the town, it was likely that at least one of them would catch Val's scent, maybe literally, depending on the powers the immortals possessed. Aged as she was, Val no longer had the strength that had helped her survive dangerous encounters when she was younger. She couldn't risk a confrontation. I could remember feeling Val's hand on my shoulder as I sat in her car. "Just stay calm and listen. I need to explain what we're going to do tonight and why." Val had to stop Angela Miller from screwing up everything. She sent her threats, shut up about magic or else. But Angela refused. She kept trying to get Zev to publish her stories, not just about her magic act, but also an exposé about a corrupt official who blackmailed prostitutes. And Val was reading Zev's emails. Val had a few assets. She was in the habit of adopting violent or poorly behaved dogs from the animal shelter to guard her as she slept. And she had, with great difficulty, managed to get a hand on a black bear. And as of about a year ago, she also had control over a man named Reuben Chalmers. Val had been repaving her driveway and had parked her car on the street. Minutes after she left the vehicle, a huge truck came racing up the road and smashed the car, totaling it. Val reported the incident to the police, but nothing came of that. In Burke's department, a wrecked car apparently did not necessitate more than a cursory investigation. Val had seen what the truck that hit her car looked like. After getting a new car, she drove around, searching for it, and found the red pickup parked outside a bar. The recently replaced front fender made it likely that this was the right truck. She found Chalmers and forced him to confess what he'd done, not only to her car, but also to the girl he had struck and left to die on the side of the road years before. Val considered forcing Chalmers to turn himself in, but as luck would have it, the man knew about magic, and his abilities were powerful. It would be a waste to send him to prison. She made Chalmers her slave, telling herself that she was rehabilitating a criminal. Under orders, Chalmers, accompanied by one of Val's dogs, confronted Angela Miller. Val just wanted to give the woman a scare, enough to let her know that she was serious. But Angela killed the dog that was sent after her. She burned the body until nothing but ash remained. Val was furious. If this stupid woman wouldn't listen to reason, then Val would take the choice away from her. All it would take was one touch, and Angela would be forced to obey. And as all of this was happening, Val was also becoming increasingly worried about where the world was going. She wanted friends, allies, to help her face what she believed was coming. She couldn't reveal the truth of magic just by telling me about it. This was the sort of thing you needed to see to believe, and Val's magic was invisible and easy to rationalize away. So Val saw an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. She arranged a meeting with Angela at the abandoned button factory. Angela's ability to conjure fire out of the air was exactly the sort of flashy thing that would be required to overcome my doubts about magic being real. "Just watch from a safe distance. Chalmers will do the talking. He'll put himself in the line of fire while I sneak around the back. As soon as I get a hand on her, it will all be over." But the confrontation didn't go as Val had planned. I got burned. Even the memory of the pain was horrible. I didn't even want to think about it. It was going to haunt my nightmares. Val was furious, but she knew how to repair the damage Angela had done to me. So Val killed her and put her life force into me. Val had turned me into what she was. I would not age until that energy Val had stolen from Angela Miller ran dry. I was marked, stained, inhuman. It was terrifying. It was disgusting. I felt like I had committed murder by proxy. Why hadn't Val asked me what I wanted, or just fucking left me out of it entirely? I hadn't asked for this. After Val ripped the life out of Angela, I wanted to forget the pain of being burned, and the reality-shattering truth of how it had happened. My mind hadn't really been ready to accept the existence of supernatural forces. Val had forced me to witness something impossible, but without any context, the easiest way to deal with that information was to fall asleep and forget about it. Let it be nothing but some distant dream. After my eye healed, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened to me. Val heard me babbling incoherently, and then she told me to go back to sleep. Val understood that I still wasn't ready to accept the truth that she knew. She realized that the immortal who had revealed the truth to her had done it slowly for a reason. An isolated event was easy to just block out and forget. Val put me to sleep and then took the shirt and bra out of my gym bag and used them to replace the burned clothes I was wearing. She knew that my mind would slip past the fact that my new shirt was blue instead of green. I didn't want to know what had happened, so I would ignore the inconsistency. Val drove us back to the college and carried me, asleep, into the back of my van. When I woke up, I told myself that I must have taken a nap. I concocted my first false memory of the drive home to explain how I had ended up where I was. But when I left the van to go into my room, Zev saw me in the hallway. He told me he wanted to talk to me. I'd never seen him so deadly serious, so I followed him into his room and waited as he closed the door. Zev wouldn't stop asking me questions. He kept trying to show me the photo that Angela Miller had texted to him. Angela had arrived at the button factory early. She had been watching from a window on the second story as I approached the front with Chalmers while Val snuck around the back. She took a picture of us and sent it to Zev. Who was this girl? Didn't she work for the newspaper? What do you know about her? I couldn't look at the picture. But Zev wouldn't stop shoving it in my face. And when I tried to physically push him away from me, fire came out of my hands. The ultimate distraction. A way to end the conversation. I inflicted upon Zev the worst experience I had ever had. An experience so terrible that I had been desperate to forget it. Logically, I knew that I hadn't hurt Zev on purpose, but I still felt like shit. I still felt like I was to blame. When the building was on fire, I was able to distract myself from buried memories that Zev had been trying to unearth. Soaked with adrenaline, I was able to grab Zev and pull him out of the building. Mel saw me carrying Zev and pressing a shirt against my mouth. Later, she would edit my face out of this memory. When I carried Zev out of the building, Val was there. She had seen the smoke and hadn't gotten far yet. Zev had seen something impossible. He had seen fire conjured out of nowhere. And Angela Miller had primed his mind with context, with the concept of psi potential, with the exact idea that humans were capable of conjuring fire. And furthermore, he had been burned. The pain made it impossible to deny what had happened, or to fall asleep in my arms and simply block out the memory. Zev's doubts had been shattered. He awakened into the world of the supernatural with the ability to channel spirits of the dead. Spirits like the scarecrow that yearned for revenge on the little girl who had killed it. The scarecrow possessed Zev. It used my shirt to choke me and throw us into the forest. Maybe it needed to get away from the crowd, from the doubtful eyes that may have been making it more difficult to manifest. Val and Mel ran into the woods after us. Everyone else who had seen what was happening had just stared blankly. No doubt they were busy coming up with reasons they had not just witnessed two people levitate and go flying into the woods. But Mel cared about me. She didn't know what was happening, and despite the terror that must have invoked for her, she knew I needed help. She ran after us. That was how she had gotten her arm burned. It was another thing to feel guilty about. I knew that I had been panicking, that I wasn't in control. But the fact was that I had exactly 2 close friends, and I had burned both of them. The scarecrow dropped Zev when we got into the woods. It wanted revenge on me, not him. So Val was able to get to Zev while the thing was choking me. She put Zev to sleep. With Zev unconscious, the scarecrow was forced out of him, or perhaps simply also forced to sleep. I remember falling to the ground and hitting my head. I woke up with a paramedic standing over me, blissfully ignorant of the horrible things I had done. I had burned down a building, the home and possessions of dozens of people. I had burned both of my friends, and I had allowed myself to forget about it. The guilt and pain, the terror and the fear, I was just reeling as the emotions slammed into me. It felt like a lot of time was passing. I had just experienced hours upon hours of memories, and I had thought about them, reacted to them. But somehow I could also sense that no time had passed at all. All those memories, and even my thoughts and feelings about them, it had all been waiting for me, just under my conscious awareness. Part of me had been aware of everything all along, feeling the guilt and the fear, remembering the pain. That part of me had been hidden behind a curtain, able to do nothing more than whisper in my ear that the Northside fire was my fault. Tearing that curtain down had given me instant, conscious awareness of not only the memories, but also the thoughts and feelings that my subconscious had been carrying all along. It had all come back to me in one searing instant of reintegration. But when the instant ended, I was still under Val's power. That warm, comforting blanket pressing down on me, suffocating my thoughts. I was relaxed, laying on the ground, just watching and listening. The warm blanket took away my pain, my fear, and my guilt. Those were all just in the past, distant memories of emotions that I had been carrying without my conscious awareness, and nothing more. The present was nothing but warmth and comfort. I didn't even feel bad for not feeling bad. It was hard to want to fight against that. It was hard to want to feel all that pain and guilt and fear, even if I now knew that I should. Val and Zev were still talking. I had only missed a bit. "Told yourself you were getting her justice, but you were just looking for your next victim," Zev said, his voice cold. "You had a taste of youth again before you gave it away, and you had to have it, for keeps this time. So you cornered him on his way to his car earlier tonight. You forced him to tell you what he did, to confess it all in a suicide note. You knew that when the coroner found the body, all that would show up was simultaneous organ failure from an unknown cause. The fingerprints you left on his hand and his forehead would probably be attributed to one of the prostitutes he confessed to blackmailing in his suicide note." "Burke was a blackmailer and a rapist," Val whispered. "He deserved to die." Beneath the blanket of calm, I felt an emotion stir. So it was Burke who had blackmailed Angela Miller. That was why he had aggressively dismissed Zev's questions about the fact that Angela had gone missing, and why he had gone out of his way to stop me from looking for both Zev and Angela. Burke hadn't known what had happened to them, but he must have been freaked out by the fact that the 2 people who were MIA were a reporter and a woman he had blackmailed. In a panic, He had pushed the town council to change an ordinance specifically in order to drive me out of town because I had been asking uncomfortable questions. He was desperately clinging to the hope that, somehow, he would get away with his crimes. But now the man was dead. Val had killed him. She was racking up a body count in the past few days. I found that vaguely interesting. The concrete floor was cool and comfortable. It made me wonder why no one ever thought to make beds out of concrete.
Maybe he did deserve it, Zev said, but the real reason you sought him out is because you wanted your youth back. You didn't truly care about getting justice for Angela. You wanted to murder someone, so you went looking for the worst person you could find.
I do care, Val said. Her voice was still weak and quiet, but it got stronger as she continued to talk. These things, you know, these thoughts you heard, it was just the last moment, when the decision was already made.
So you admit that those were your thoughts?
The demon was whispering in your ear. Maybe it did use some truth in order to lie to you. But I wrestled with these decisions before I made them. When it came time to act, I was decisive. But it wasn't easy reaching that point.
Lie to yourself if you want, Zev said. With each life you take, you become less and less hesitant, less guilty about the pleasure of filling yourself with someone else's life force. Now that you can justify killing people, how long before you do it again?
It's easy for you to criticize from the sidelines, Val said. Her voice was steady now, but I did what had to be done to save you.
I could almost believe that. If you didn't keep telling yourself what a good person you are every time you kill someone.
Zev's demeanor shifted. He was leaning slightly forward, readying himself to move. Val noticed, and I felt her weight shifting. She was on her knees beside me. Zev looked like he might lunge at her, and he had the advantage of being on his feet. Of course, the second Zev touched Val, he would no longer be capable of violence. She would be in his mind. She wouldn't let him hurt her. It all seemed vaguely interesting. I was aware that Val was the reason I wasn't hurting, and that if something happened to her, the pain would come back. But even that thought didn't concern me. It all just seemed so distant, almost unreal. What was real was the warmth of Val's gentle hand on my arm, and the soothing coolness and hardness of the floor beneath me.
Zev was staring daggers at Val. I'm always acting like an asshole, he said, but at least I never pretend to be anything else.
You are a good person, Zev, Val said. That's why I saved you. Zev blinked. He was far away, and it was dark, but I thought his eyes might have started to water. I could see from his face that he had wanted to believe those words, that, despite everything, hearing them had affected him. Zev's voice came out a little hoarser.
Get away from her,
he said. You learned all this information while possessed by a demon, Val said. You know what that thing was, don't you?
I saw everything that thing made me do, Zev said.
I could tell his throat was still tight.
But everything I learned, it was when you forced me to sleep.
The demon was still inside you. It just couldn't move your body.
Stop acting like you know what that thing was.
Based on what I saw, I think it was an arachne demon. It takes the form of a small spider and controls threads, vocal cords, textiles.
Zev sneered, unimpressed. That thing, it was nothing but rage and malevolence. It wasn't subtle.
Perhaps that's what the demon wanted you to believe.
Shut up, Zev growled. You killed Angela. You can't talk your way past that.
If you saw what she did,
you're the one who put her in that position.
And if you were in my position, you would have done the same, Val shot back. She glanced down at me and then turned her glare back to Zev. We both know who you really care about. Zev looked taken aback. Wait. Did Val mean what I thought she meant? But that was ridiculous. Wasn't it? Don't pretend you wouldn't have made the same trade I did, Val said. Zev's hands clenched into fists.
His eyes flashed with anger. "Get off her," Zev said. "Now!" I felt Val straighten up a little, but she didn't move. "Fine," Zev spat. He rushed forward, swinging wildly with his fists, a display that might have been intimidating if it wasn't so obvious that he didn't know how to fight. Val made no effort to move back. When Zev got close enough, her hand lashed out, grabbing one of his swinging arms. "Stop!" she commanded. "No!" Zev screamed. He wrested his hand from her grasp. I saw Val's eyes go wide with surprise and fear. That was when Zev leapt over my supine body and pounced on Val. Val's hand left my arm as she was knocked backward onto the concrete with Zev on top of her. A tiny voice inside me whispered that this was my chance. Now that Val was no longer touching me, I would be able to fight against her control of my thoughts. My arm twinged with pain. I started to realize that the ground was not as comfortable as I had thought. My head, back, and hips were all aching where they pressed against the hard concrete. I felt like I was trying to wake up, to blink sleep out of my eyes. I had to push the waves of comfort and relaxation away, to feel the pain in my arm, to return to reality. But the pain was distant. I was tired. I was in a fog. I threw myself against the warm, comfortable blanket in my mind, but all the mental force I could muster seemed to melt against it. It was like punching a blanket that was hanging on a laundry line. The blanket moved, but it didn't hurt. It simply enveloped my fist. I managed to force myself to rise, to turn up on my side using my right hand. The makeshift sling kept my left arm comfortable against me. Up on my side, I could see what was happening next to me. I saw Zev on top of Val, his hands around her throat. It was a startling sight. Zev was a small man, but Val wasn't much bigger, and Zev looked like he had escaped from some kind of institution with the bandages all over his body. That was when I realized I could see Val's chest rising and falling. Zev's hands were on her throat, but they weren't squeezing. Val glanced at me. "Relax," she said. I wanted to shake my head, to argue with her, but my mind was still hazy. I knew I didn't like what was happening, but I couldn't articulate the reason why, not even to myself. Wasn't it good that the fight was over? Val reached out and grasped my hand. I almost pulled away from her, but my reflexes were too sluggish. When Val's hand touched mine again, all my doubts disappeared. Soon I was up on my knees. Zev climbed off of Val. His eyes looked glazed over as he started helping Val up onto her feet. After that, they both helped me up. It was a little difficult to rise with one arm in a sling. "Everything's going to be okay now," Val said. She almost sounded like she was talking to herself. This is just going to be temporary. You both just need time to get used to this." Val moved us until I was on her left side, so she could hold my right hand, while my left was in the sling. Zev moved toward her other side, holding her other hand. "Neither of you have seen death before," Val said, "but once the shock wears off..." Val started walking us toward the busted-up doorway. We followed, instinctively knowing what she wanted us to do. Zev moved to be the first through the doorway, and we all walked outside, hand in hand, out into the moonlight. The crickets were chirping in the woods around the abandoned parking lot. We were both completely under her control. It was over. Chapter 28. The cricket song was quieter without the enhanced hearing I'd had when I walked up the hill. The moonlight was dimmer, but bright enough to illuminate the cracked pavement of the driveway. The woods surrounding us were dark, but not threatening. It was a peaceful, beautiful night. Zev and I were holding hands with Val. Her control over us was irresistible. And
And that was good. I was tired anyway. I was happy to fall into the rest and comfort of following along with whatever Val wanted me to do. Unbidden, the image came to me of Chalmers, of the way his body had fallen limply onto the concrete, making no motion to prevent his skull from smacking against the ground. He had looked a lot like Angela when the life had gone out of her eyes. Those images stirred something in me, a quiet voice in my head, my own voice. Val is controlling Zev too, right now. Her attention is divided, and she's tired. She has used her powers a lot tonight. She just finished ripping the life out of Chalmers and putting it into Zev. Don't give her a chance to rest and recover. I wanted to ignore that quiet voice in my head. I was so tired. And I could feel my left arm tingling with pain that I didn't want to experience. But then I heard Zev's voice echoing in my brain. Now that you can justify killing people, how long before you do it again? Then I imagined the face of Deputy Chief Burke, his bald pate glistening above the vein throbbing in his head. I could see the light going out of his eyes as he crumpled to the ground. Burke was an asshole. He had committed heinous crimes. But he should have faced justice. The truth should have come out. Val could have used her position as an editor, as a journalist, to tell the truth about Burke. Instead, she had taken matters into her own hands. And then I imagined something else. I could see this new, younger Val arguing with Zev, their words indistinct. I could see anger rise in her until she put a hand on Zev's forehead. I could see Zev's eyes glaze over before he crumpled to the ground. Zev was right about Val. She had crossed a line. And this might just be the last, best chance I would have at breaking her control over me. I gathered all the mental fortitude I could muster, grit my teeth against the pain in my left arm, and threw my will into telling myself to stop walking and pull my hand out of Val's. Nothing happened. I kept walking along beside Val, my hand clasped in hers. It was like I had just shouted, "Stop moving," at a bulldozer whose driver was wearing ear protection. My legs just kept stepping forward. I tried again. "Stop it! Get out of my head!" Warmth and comfort enveloped me in response. What was I so worried about? Everything was finally going to be okay. Val wasn't going to kill Zev. Why would she? My van was waiting at the bottom of the hill. There was plenty of space in the back, and Zev and I were both so tired. But that would be fine. We could rest on the mattress in the back of the van. We could finally go to sleep and let Val drive us wherever she wanted us to go. I strained every fiber of my being and found that I was just able to push the warmth surrounding me back. It was like shoving up against a heavy mattress, pushing it up and away from my nose and mouth just long enough to gasp in a breath of independent thought. But I could still feel the overwhelming weight of the mattress pressing down, ready to smother me again. I had to think quickly, while I was capable of thinking. I couldn't fight against Val's control with sheer mental force. She was too strong for that. I had to be clever. I had to think of something I could use to break her control over me. The thought came to me, an impossible thought. A lie. Could I convince myself to believe something that I knew was a lie, even if just for a moment? Would it even work? It was my only chance. It was worth a try. I just had to realize that Val couldn't possibly be controlling my thoughts because it was impossible. Hypnosis? No, that was bullshit. Magical powers? Monsters? It was ridiculous, obviously. Everything that has been happening was some kind of crazy dream. I had to wake up. I had to believe that Val's powers didn't really exist. If I could do that, I could stop her from affecting me.
just like I had with Isabel in the back of my van when she had tried to make a ball of light appear in front of me. Because I knew it was impossible. There had been some kind of power inside me that I had thrown against Isabel's power, an invisible battle of wills that I hadn't been consciously aware of, but had won. I forced myself to try to grasp onto the rational world that I had known for most of my life. I strained to believe with all my heart that everything crazy that had happened in the past week had all just been a fever dream. But nothing happened. I was still walking calmly down the hill. Val's hand was warm in mine. I saw a mosquito fly in front of my eyes, and I thought I felt it land on my cheek, but it didn't bother me. It was a gentle feeling, almost like a caress. And if the mosquito was hungry, why would I care if it bit me? I could share a little blood. Life was nothing but beauty and wonder. Nothing could bother me right now. I shoved the crushing, comforting mattress off of my mind and took in another desperate breath of pain and individuality. That was when I latched onto a thought, and I felt it click into place, almost as if part of me had been waiting for it. I was drunk. I pictured myself going into a bar. I could almost see it happening. Northside had burned down. Zev was missing. My job at the Sentinel was in jeopardy. Everything was falling apart, and I wanted to forget about it. I knew that I shouldn't, but I wanted to take the pain away. I ordered a drink. Something hard. I had my ID. I was 21. No one could stop me. That was when all of this had started. And now I was on a bender. I liked drinking too much, just like I always worried that I would. Once I started, I couldn't stop. I suddenly lost track of how I was walking and stumbled forward. I would have tripped and fallen, but Val's grip on my hand stopped me. A giggle erupted from my mouth, from my lungs. I felt it, felt that it was mine. My whole body was mine. My left arm hurt like hell in the makeshift sling, and my head was swimming. I tasted alcohol on my breath. I felt it burning in my stomach. Okay, I thought, desperately trying to reverse the gears inside my head. Okay, that's enough. But I felt the bile rising in my throat. I pitched forward onto my knees and started puking on the ground. My hand was still being squeezed in someone else's grip. I could hear voices, but they were distorted, echoing. No, I thought. No, I wasn't really drunk. I was just trying to do something. I felt Val let go of my hand. She started pulling my hair back so that I could keep throwing up without getting it in my hair. My first heave had managed to miss. I made out her voice over the haze the alcohol was putting across my thoughts. It's okay. We'll go to the hospital and get you checked out. I finished throwing up, and then only barely managed to crawl away from the pool of vomit before flopping a little gracelessly onto my side on the ground. The stabbing pain in my arm made it more difficult, but it reminded me to be careful not to land on that arm or put pressure on it. Val let go of my hair, but she moved quickly, putting her hand on my shoulder, patting my back. Eliza, you're going to be okay. It's all okay now. I moaned in pain. The white-hot knife in my arm had returned with a vengeance. I couldn't tell if the drunken haze that was making my head hurt was making the pain better or worse. Wait. My thoughts were slow, but I realized something. Val was telling me I was okay, but I wasn't. She was out of my head. She was trying to get back in, but she couldn't. And I was aware of all of it. My plan had worked. When I had focused my belief on the idea that Val's power couldn't affect me, I had made it so. I could still picture myself going out and getting drunk. I could picture it vividly, almost more vividly than my true memories. But I knew it was just a story I had told myself to break Val's hold over me. But the pounding in my head and the churning in my stomach weren't going away. I groaned and thought I was going to throw up again. I doubted that I could walk. Val and Zev were gently lifting me so that they could slip their arms under my shoulders and hips and carry me. No, I mumbled. I wanted to tell Zev something, but I couldn't figure out how to shape my mouth around the words. I felt like I was going to pass out. No, I groaned. No, Zev, no, don't. It was all I was able to do as Val and Zev hoisted me up between them, straining to lift and carry me. I had gotten Val out of my head, for now, but how long would it last? If it wasn't permanent, then it was an utterly pointless victory. It was quite possible that all I had done was force myself to experience more unnecessary pain. My left eye started twitching. I closed it. My face feels so hot, I mumbled. It's okay, Elle, Val's voice whispered. It's okay. I felt the heat leaving my cheeks. The pain in my arm started fading again. She was getting back into my head. That thought brought with it a surge of adrenaline. A single moment where my heart pounded just hard enough to force sufficient blood and oxygen into my brain to allow me to rise out of the drunken haze for just one moment, just long enough to tell myself one more story. I was on a bender. I bought a ton of beer and wine, stashed it in the back of my van, and drove here to the button factory to drink it. Zev had found me somehow. I must have texted him after I tripped and broke my arm. Yeah, that was why my arm was exploding with pain. Zev was trying to help me. But there was this other girl who came too. I didn't know her. Zev didn't know her. Why was she here? And why was Zev doing what she was telling him to do? That was the weirdest thing that was happening right now, wasn't it? My head was pounding and aching, and the pain in my arm was excruciating. But I knew I had to focus as hard as I could on the story I was telling myself. I had to mentally shout it loud enough to drown out all the other thoughts I was having. Zev never let anyone tell him what to do. Zev, I slurred out, why are you acting like this bitch is the boss of you? I felt the haze over my thoughts get thicker. The edges of my vision turned gray. Pain exploded in my left arm, the left side of my head, and my left hip. I was barely able to realize what had happened. I had been dropped onto the pavement. I was lying on my fractured arm, and it was screaming out in pain, but it was hard to move. I couldn't sort out how to do it. And I knew there was one more thing I had to do. I had to tell him. If I couldn't tell him, none of it would matter. I managed to make my lips move. I felt the side of my mouth scraping against the pavement, and I tasted dirt. But I had to carry through. I had to say it, or none of this would matter. Don't let her touch you, I moaned. I couldn't tell if Zev had heard me or not. And I could feel my head throbbing. My vision was blurry. I really was drunk, and I didn't like it after all. I was going to pass out. I flailed around with my legs until I managed to turn myself onto my back to get the weight off my arm. It hurt so bad, and my head was spinning so much. I wanted the pain to stop. I was sure that if it wasn't for the horrible, agonizing pain, I could just fall asleep right here on the dirty ground. I looked up and saw two blurry shapes, one with lighter skin, one with darker skin. The darker-skinned shape had a stick in his hands, a big one. He was waving it at the other shape and yelling at her. I thought she was going up the hill, but it was all so blurry. I closed my eyes. I only remember the rest of the night in bits and pieces. At some point, Zev asked me where my keys were. I tried to tell him, but all that came out was a slurry mess of syllables. I remember Zev apologizing as he put his hands in my pockets, very daintily, trying not to touch my butt any more than he had to. I remember his arms around me, carrying me.
surprisingly strong, even though he was huffing and puffing. And then there were lights that were way too bright. Someone was in trouble, dying. Was it me? Chapter 29. I was floating in a void, nothing but darkness. Absolute, horrifying nothingness. No sound, no smell, no taste. I couldn't feel my tongue resting against the bottom of my mouth. I couldn't taste my own saliva, a constant sensation I had hardly been aware of until it was gone. I was in a void. No feeling of clothing or even air against my skin. Not hot, not cold. Just no feeling of temperature at all. It's stunning to realize how many sensations exist as an undercurrent of every moment of normal existence. Being cut off from them was terrifying. I was conscious, but the background radiation of conscious experience was gone. I had my thoughts and nothing more. I drifted, overwhelmed by the nothingness. I couldn't scream. I had no mouth, no tongue, no vocal cords, no breath. Was I dead? I could remember people shouting, sounding worried. I think someone said that someone was dying. Suddenly, a light broke into the emptiness in the distance. I wanted to move toward it, anything to free me from the unbearableness of the void. But I had no limbs, no body. I had to wait, painfully long, as the light rushed toward me. It moved quickly, but every second of waiting was excruciating. The light was bright, bright as sunlight. It was when I became consciously aware of the fact that I was experiencing the sensation of sight without the sensation of having eyes that the light suddenly burned, and in a flash my eyes were squinting against the brightness of it. I blinked as a roaring sound erupted in my ears, and I felt cold air on my left ear and warm air on my right. I was standing barefoot on damp grass. I could feel a shirt hanging from my shoulders and the texture of denim against the skin of my legs. I could feel air in my lungs and a tongue in my mouth. It was dark, but the field I stood in was lit up by a roaring fire on my right side, a fire that was 2 stories tall. It was north side. But the rest of the landscape was missing. The light of the fire illuminated a field of grass around the burning building, but past the grass was nothing but the void. A voice spoke in my ear, and I jumped. The voice sounded just like my voice. Not again. I realized that the voice sounded like the voice I heard in my head when I spoke, not like the recordings I had heard of the way other people hear my voice. I spun around to face the source of the sound. It was the scarecrow, standing behind me with its crooked grin. I raised my fists to defend myself, but the scarecrow didn't move. It was just looking at me, but also looking away, those sewn-on blue eyes glancing to one side, and it was grinning with that crooked row of tiny black buttons. I took a step back, half expecting the scarecrow to leap at me in response. The damp grass was slippery underneath my bare feet. If I wasn't careful, I was going to slip and fall if I tried to run away. But where was I going to run? I didn't want to go back to that dark void. I'd rather die than risk being permanently trapped in that horror of empty consciousness. I took another step back, and again the scarecrow didn't move. I stared at it. After a moment, it spoke again. Its head bobbed slightly as it spoke, but the buttons forming the crooked grin remained fixed in place. "Not again," I heard my own voice say. "Understand." Was that a question, asking me if I understood something? The inflection on the word had been flat, not raised to indicate a query. The scarecrow just stood still. I felt its gaze on me, despite the sidewards glancing eyes sewn to the burlap of its face. I could sense that it was still waiting for me to say something. But despite the fact that the thing hadn't been advancing toward me, it still made me nervous. It was literally a creature out of my nightmares. But it just kept looking at me, still waiting. I bit my lip, and then, finally, opened my mouth. I said, "What?" "Don't do again," the scarecrow said, enunciating each word. But along with the words came a feeling rising in my mind. I could tell it was coming from the scarecrow. It felt similar to having Val in my head, but less invasive. These were thoughts offered to the surface of my mind, easy to distinguish from my own. Information being shared, not control being taken. I felt the enormous effort that it took the scarecrow to put its thoughts into words. Speaking wasn't what the thing did. It wasn't what the thing was for. Those few words, "don't do again," it was an enormous struggle to manage them. Now that the thing had my attention, I knew what it was talking about. The way I had told myself magic wasn't real, so I could break Val's power over myself and Zev. The scarecrow stood still, waiting. I could sense that it wanted to know if I understood what it was trying to tell me. I frowned. "Why?" I asked. My own voice came out of the scarecrow again. "Hurts," it said. Again, the word carried more meaning with it. What I had done hadn't just hurt the scarecrow. I had been hurting myself, too. But I didn't regret what I had done. I didn't know if I had survived it, but I hadn't been about to just let Val enslave me. And why should I trust this scarecrow anyway? Wasn't this thing some kind of demon that had tried to kill me multiple times? The scarecrow shook its head, as if in response to my thoughts. "So if you aren't the demon, what are you?" The scarecrow simply shrugged. "I am what I am," it seemed to be saying. "Look," I said, "I don't know if I can trust you." The scarecrow shrugged again, but differently. This time, the shrug communicated helplessness. It wasn't that the scarecrow didn't want to answer the question. It was that it didn't know how. "Are you part of me?" I asked. Maybe the thing was some kind of manifestation of my own subconscious mind. "Yes," the scarecrow said in a halting voice. "No. Yes. No." An image came along with the voice, something I just couldn't make any sense out of. I saw a labyrinth of copper pipes twisted around themselves, like one of those wooden block puzzles that are difficult to pull apart. A bright, glowing liquid was flowing through the pipes. The water came from outside the pipes, and there was a plumber somewhere, a godlike figure who operated the tap, deciding what type of water to allow to flow through the pipes. The image itself was clear, but I had no understanding of the connection between it and the question I asked. Was it saying I was the pipes? The plumber? The glowing water? "I don't understand," I said. And then I saw a field of flowers and a huge swarm of butterflies in 1,000 scintillating colors. The butterflies flew from flower to flower, sipping the sweetness of the nectar. As they drank the nectar, they grew. Some of the butterflies were as small as flower petals, and others were as large as birds. The biggest ones were the size of hawks, but as they got larger, they got clumsier. Their wings started to flap out of rhythm with one another, until the butterflies' wings tore apart from the strain, and then each wing started flying in different directions. They glowed and shifted until what was once one huge butterfly had become 2 smaller ones. I felt that the scarecrow was trying to tell me that the butterflies were not the same as the flowers, but that they were made from the flowers. That was when I noticed the flowers blooming and growing. They needed the butterflies to spread their pollen, or they would wither and die. The image faded. I understood part of what was being communicated, some kind of symbiotic relationship, but it was too abstract. It didn't really tell me what the scarecrow was, just that it was trying to say that the two of us, broadly speaking, were on the same team. "I don't get it," I said. The scarecrow shrugged. It was giving up. And then it spoke again, as if to indicate that it didn't matter whether I understood what it was or not. What mattered was the message it was struggling to get across to me. "Hurts," the scarecrow repeated. "Don't. Do." And then I saw a woman with a glowing sword and a gleaming white cape, a heroic figure. She lived in a village, a harmonious place. The villagers loved and trusted her, and everyone thrived because of her. The hero lived in a grand castle, but often came riding out on a white horse. The villagers would crowd around the castle, basking in the glory of her company. But one day, the hero took a torch and burned down one of the villagers' houses. Some of the villagers wanted to fight the fire, but others thought the hero had a good reason for burning down the house and wanted the fire to be left to continue going. Neighbor began to fight against neighbor. Teeth were being knocked out, lips split open, noses broken. The fire was consuming the house, but no one could fight the fire because they were all too busy fighting one another. Then, with one wave of her hand, the hero called down a rainstorm and put out the flames. She nodded to herself and then walked away, back to her castle. The villagers were startled and confused. They stopped fighting and started talking amongst themselves about what the hero's enigmatic actions had meant. Although the fire was out, the house was badly burned and the roof had collapsed. It could not be used in the state it had been left in. But every time one of the villagers suggested repairing the house, the argument would break out again. Some villagers thought they should finish destroying the house, clean up the rubble, and plant wheat where the house had stood. After all, the hero had set the house on fire. The hero must want the house gone and something else in its place. Others said that the hero had called down rain to extinguish the flames because she had changed her mind. She wanted the house restored. So the ruins remained as they were. Nothing could get done until peace and harmony in the village had been restored. This time, I thought I could understand the story a little better. I was the hero, setting a fire and then putting it out again. I was confusing the villagers and sowing chaos. But I was also the village itself. I had damaged my mind, set fire to part of it. And unless the villagers, the scarecrow, could work out what I wanted, the damage would be impossible to repair. The scarecrow wanted to repair the village, to help me put my mind back in order. But I had turned it against itself. It was still trying to repair the damage, not only to itself, but also to me. The images faded. I pondered what I had seen for a moment. "I still don't feel like I completely understand," I said. I raised my hand to stop the scarecrow before it could give me another confusing parable. "But I get it. What I did hurt both of us. I won't do it again." The scarecrow's face didn't change. It was sewn on. But those eyes that were glancing away somehow conveyed uneasiness. It didn't trust me to follow through on my promise. The scarecrow sighed. "Hurts," it said. And then it was gone. I was alone in the field with the burning building, and hit with an overwhelming wave of tiredness. The flames faded, and I drifted off into the darkness. There were other dreams after that one, less vivid and harder to remember. I remember the scarecrow swinging its huge butcher knife. Once I didn't get away, and the knife sliced off my leg. I stumbled and fell, panicked and terrified, but not feeling any pain. I tried to scramble away, but couldn't stop the scarecrow from swinging the knife again, lopping off my other leg. I tried to drag my body with my arms, but the scarecrow swung the knife again and again, leaving me as a terrified, limbless torso, unable to move as the thing just laughed and laughed. Another time, the scarecrow swung the butcher knife into me, and I felt it bite into my flesh with an explosion of pain, shattering the reality of the dream and transporting me somewhere else, lying on something soft with my eyes closed. I heard voices I didn't recognize and couldn't understand. I was too tired to move. I drifted and faded back into more nightmares. I dreamed about a blanket with 2 ripped eye holes chasing me, sometimes with a lantern, sometimes with a butcher knife. Once, the ghost was on fire and flew at me until it fell onto my face and burned out my left eye. A few times, a dark-haired woman in purple lingerie threw fire at me. Once, I dreamed that I had my hands wrapped around her throat and strangled her as she pleaded, "Don't kill me! Please don't kill me!" I don't know if I dreamed about anything other than pain and death, or if those were just the only parts I remembered. Everything was a jumble, except for that first dream, which had been so intense that it burned itself into my memory. I remember waking up and noticing aching pain in my left arm and a stabbing sensation of uncomfortable pressure in the crook of my right elbow. At first, I thought it was a snake, fangs latched onto me. But then, in a moment of cogent thought, I realized that the sensation I was feeling was likely the needle of an IV. I relaxed and drifted away again. Val was in the next dream, the new young Val with the familiar yet unfamiliar face. I was lying in a hospital bed, and she stood over me with a scalpel in her hand. I knew she was about to cut into me. I had to get away, but the sheets were all tangled around my legs, holding them in place. Val was lowering the scalpel toward my left eye. I could see the blade coming closer. "I just need to change this out," Val said. "You'll thank me later." I tried to raise my arms, to shove against the hand holding the descending blade, but I felt rough gardening gloves latch onto my wrists, pinning me spread-eagled. I heard the crackling, leaf-crunching sound of the scarecrow's laughter. The scalpel got larger. It was all my left eye could see. I couldn't get away. I screamed. The scalpel cut into my eye, and half of my vision went dark. The rough hands on my wrists exploded into white-hot fire. The pain was just as excruciating as it had been when the scarecrow had grabbed my ankle when I was younger. I flailed out with my arms and legs, and they moved. I felt my elbows pushing against the mattress that was underneath me. I abruptly realized that my right arm was free, so I threw it out in front of my face, but my flailing hand encountered nothing but empty air. My left arm felt heavy and constrained. I swung out with it, but it moved awkwardly and ended up banging against something hard with an explosion of pain. I realized that my eyes were closed. My left eye still burned with phantom pain, but I could feel the eyelid closed over it. I tried to open my eyes, but the light was too bright, so I closed them again. I heard something, not the scarecrow laughing. It was a human sound, people cheering and applauding. It sounded too distant to be real. It must have been coming out of a television or a radio. I kicked out with my legs. There was a sheet over them, but it wasn't alive and wrapping itself around me. It was just a sheet. No, heavier than a sheet and a blanket. I heard a voice, a gruff baritone. "Reggie, yeah, she just started convulsing. I think you need to get over here." I realized why my left arm was feeling so stiff, constrained, and heavy. Something was wrapped around it. A cast. Where was I? A hospital? The gruff voice spoke again. "No, just all of a sudden." Behind that voice were the more distant sounds of 2 people shouting and arguing, something about a car. Half of the words were bleeped. Daytime television, I thought. That was when I comprehended that I had woken up from another nightmare. The phantom pain from the dream had faded and was replaced by the dull, persistent ache in my left arm. Not that bad, actually, considering that the arm was broken. I tried to open my eyes again and blinked against the brightness of the room. The source of the light was right above me, right where my eyes had been facing. It was a warm, yellow light, not the blue fluorescent light that I normally would have expected in a hospital room. I turned my head away from the light, toward the source of the gruff voice. I blinked, and my eyes slowly adjusted to show me walls covered in ugly, striped wallpaper. I was lying in a big bed. I thought it was king-sized. On a chest of drawers in front of me sat a big, boxy television. Behind me was a large wooden headboard. That was probably what I had banged into with my left arm. In front of the television and a bit to the right side of the bed was a small armchair, also ugly and striped in colors that clashed with the wallpaper. Seated in the chair was a huge man with shoulders like a gorilla, beady brown eyes, and a fuzz of very short black hair. He was holding a cell phone to his ear, looking nervous. "Doberman?" My voice came out as a croak. The big man turned to look at me. "Hang on," he said into the phone. "She just said something." "Why are you here?" I asked. I realized after saying it that the question was a little rude, but I had been expecting someone else, Zev, or maybe Mel. But Doberman was still listening to the voice on the other end of the cell phone at his ear. It looked comically small in his huge, meaty hand. "Yeah, okay," Doberman said into the phone. Then he projected his voice toward me and asked, "Hey kid, can you tell me what your name is?" I brought up my right hand to wipe the crustiness out of my eyes. "Eliza Cartwright." "Yeah, no, she answered," Doberman said into the phone. I glanced down at myself as I realized that I was dressed in unfamiliar clothing. A neon yellow shirt and a pair of bright red sweatpants. Not colors I ever would have chosen for myself. Whose were these? I realized that it was probably a good thing I wasn't wearing the clothes I could remember wearing the last time I had been conscious. I was pretty sure those clothes had gotten covered in vomit. I didn't smell any vomit, though, not even a trace of it, which meant, most likely, that someone had washed me off. Someone had taken off my clothes, given me a sponge bath, and then put new clothes on me. Oh God, had it been Doberman? The man had turned out to be surprisingly helpful, but he was still a creepy older guy who ran a strip club. The thought of his beady eyes assessing my naked body, comparing it perhaps to a catalog of beautiful women who worked at the Dover Delight, that was deeply disturbing all on its own. But whoever had cleaned me up had done a lot more than get an eyeful. God damn it, Zev, you didn't let Doberman do this, did you? "Hey kid, Doc says you should give me a countdown from 10. Can you answer some questions first?" Now that I was fully awake, I was impatient to find out who had cleaned me up. I wasn't sure I liked the idea of Zev doing it much more than Doberman. The whole concept of anyone at all cleaning off my body and dressing me like a toddler who had soiled a diaper was gross and uncomfortable. Still, I wanted to know. Rip that Band-Aid off and get it over with. "Yeah, no," Doberman said into the phone. "She's lucid. You can get back to it. Later, Reggie." Doberman switched off the cell phone. "Who, I began, but then hesitated and let my voice trail. I grabbed the edge of my shirt indicatively, hoping I wouldn't have to spell it out. But the big man hadn't been paying attention. He was looking around for the remote control to the television. Finally having located it, he switched off the trashy program. Then he noticed that I was looking in his direction. "You all right?" he asked. "Did you do this?" The words came out as a demand. Vince Doberman raised his hands in an I didn't do nothing gesture. "Jesus," Doberman muttered. "You try to help a girl." Oh God, it had been Doberman. Damn it, Zev! I felt my face heating up as my temper got the better of me. "I never asked you to," I sputtered, cutting myself off. I didn't want to say out loud what Doberman had done. I wanted to bleach the memory out of that big, meaty skull. Failing that,
I wanted us both to agree to never discuss it. Ever. Doberman finally noticed that I was clutching at the strange yellow shirt I was wearing. "Hey, I'm just on guard duty," Doberman said. "Ma's the one who got you cleaned up." "What? You mean your mother?" "She helps at the dock sometimes." A wave of relief spread over me, followed immediately by another surge of humiliation as I imagined an unfamiliar woman wiping vomit off of me. I still didn't like this. But if someone had to do it, at least it was a woman. I didn't know if the fact that she was a stranger to me made me feel better or worse. "There was a doctor?" I asked. "Yeah, he said you just needed some bed rest." "But why are you here?" I said, realizing after saying it that the way I had phrased the question may have been rude, and that Doberman had already said that he was on guard duty. That was the moment when I realized where I was. The ugly hotel room. It must be one of the rooms in the Dover Delight. Where else could it be? So Doberman was protecting me and giving me a place to stay. I mean, I backpedaled. Not that I'm not, that didn't really come out the way I... "Jeez, kid," Doberman said. "Don't strain yourself trying to thank me." Before I could say anything else, the door burst open. Zev came into view in the hallway, breathing heavily. He just looked at me for a second, huffing and puffing. I looked back at him. There were big bags under his eyes, but I could see the relief flooding into him as he saw that I was sitting up. He was staring at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered to him. It was a little unnerving. Was he looking at me like that just because of the terrible shit we had both been through in the past few days? Or was it possible that Val had gotten to him while I had been unconscious? Was she in control of Doberman too? And just waiting for me to wake up so that she could reestablish control over my mind as well? But there was another explanation for that intense stare. I remembered when Val had said that Zev would have traded Angela's life away for mine, just like she had. That she knew how Zev felt about me. But Val had been assuming that we had been living together. She had gotten our relationship all wrong. On top of that, her entire perspective was warped. I couldn't trust anything she said. No, Zev had been hanging around Angela Miller, flirting with her, mourning her now that she was dead. Angela was a self-described goth babe, a professionally beautiful woman with dark hair, pale skin, and a lot of makeup and piercings. That was the kind of woman Zev found attractive. But now, Zev was staring at me like I was the only thing he could see. I knew why, though. I had felt the same way in that warehouse. Zev was just relieved that I was alive. I had saved him. I had released him from Val's control and gotten hurt in the process. If Zev was free of Val's control, it still made sense for him to have some intense feelings about seeing me conscious again. I had to be on my guard, though, to make sure that Val wasn't pulling anyone's strings. I sat up in the bed, swinging my legs over the side. I was surprised at how strong and alert I felt so soon after being unconscious. "Zev," I said, "what happened? Why did you bring me here?" "I couldn't take you to the hospital," Zev said, still catching his breath. "Not with Val out there." I nodded at that. So if Val did have control over Zev, she had at least instructed him to pretend it wasn't true. Or maybe Zev really had gotten us away from her. But I wasn't going to stop being suspicious. Not yet. "But how did you know he could help?" I asked, tilting my head toward Doberman. "Angie told me," Zev said. "She said Vince knew a doctor." "And Reggie said you'd be fine," Doberman interjected pointedly, reminding us not to talk about him as if he wasn't sitting right between us. "Reggie?" I asked. "He's never wrong," Doberman said. "He said you just needed a few days." "What? Days?" 3 days, Zev clarified. "Just like Reggie said," Doberman added. I was unconscious for 3 days? I couldn't believe it. After being out that long, I should feel weak and shaky, but I felt strong, like waking up after an especially solid night of sleep. I did notice abruptly that I was hungry, ravenous. But I couldn't let myself get distracted. "What do you mean Reggie's never wrong?" I asked. "The doctor," Zev said. "He's like us." "What, you mean he's a magic doctor?" "If you want to put it that way," Doberman snorted. "Reggie always knows exactly what's wrong, and how long it'll take to get better." "He said your mind was fighting itself," Zev said, "and that you'd be fine once you'd sorted it out," Doberman finished. I frowned. 3 days? I asked. It was still hard to believe. I felt like I could jump out of bed and jog right across the street to the gas station and buy a donut, and a sandwich, and a hot dog. But I didn't have my wallet. The pockets of the bright red sweatpants were empty. "I texted and covered for you," Zev said. "What? With who?" "Lockwood, and your roommate. I told him your dad had a heart attack and you had to go back to Indiana." "What?" I said, feeling alarmed. Too much information was coming at me too quickly. "Your dad's fine," Zev said quickly. "Far as I know, anyway." Right, I thought. It was just a lie to explain my absence. "How did you get into my phone?" I asked. "I just came in here and used your fingerprint," Zev said. I nodded. With all the craziness going on, I had almost forgotten to worry about something as mundane as my job. I was glad that it had occurred to Zev. I decided to risk being direct with my next question. "What about Val? How do you know she won't find us here?" "Val's gone," Zev said. He sounded certain, calm. I felt my hackles rise. "How can you be sure?" Zev said. "Well, I had Angie following her. Val skipped town. We don't think she's coming back." "What? Angela Miller is alive?" "No," Zev said. His voice got a little tight. "I called her up. Her ghost." I looked away from him. Tension and guilt warred for dominance in the pit of my stomach. Had Angela's ghost told Zev that I was the reason that she was dead? How much did she know about what had happened? Did she know I hadn't meant to be there? That I had been under Val's control? That I never would have asked her to do what she did? A silence hung in the air for a moment. Zev broke the silence first. "It's my thing, I guess," he said. "Calling up ghosts." "It's just the conjuring," Doberman said, giving Zev a light punch on the shoulder. "You're calling up an echo. Angie's soul's in a better place." "She's real enough," Zev said quietly. "Just the conjuring," Doberman insisted. Zev shrugged at Doberman. I knew that shrug. The "I'm sure you're wrong, but whatever" shrug. "Hey," Zev said, turning toward the big man. "Can you leave us alone for a bit?" I felt a strange flutter in my stomach as Zev closed the door to the hotel room behind Doberman. When he turned away from the door, I felt his eyes on me as he walked over to the bed to sit down next to me. Zev's eyes still looked like they were drinking in the sight of me. I suddenly felt strangely self-conscious about the neon yellow t-shirt and bright red sweatpants I was wearing. But Zev's hungry-looking stare was just because I had gotten myself hurt trying to release him from Val's control. He must have felt guilty about it. But really, I had been saving both of us. We'd both relied on the other in order to get away. Still, it must have been difficult. Until he took me to the doctor, Zev hadn't known whether I would live or die. I had gone through something similar myself, hadn't I? I didn't know how much Zev meant to me as a friend until I thought he might be dead. Zev collapsed onto the bed next to me. I turned to face him, sitting cross-legged as he moved until he was sprawled out and lounging on his side. The tight curls of his bleached blonde hair looked as off-puttingly radioactive as ever.
It was a shame he didn't choose a milder color. If he wanted to go blonde, a richer, more golden shade might have made a nice contrast with his warm brown complexion and the rich chestnut hue of his eyes. Zev was several inches shorter than I was, and just as narrow. Even spread out lounging, I felt acutely aware of the fact that he was smaller than me. Maybe that was the reason I had always thought of him like an annoying little brother. But I could remember what it felt like when I was hovering on the edge of consciousness and Zev was carrying me into the van. He was surprisingly strong and gentle. No, this whole line of thinking was way too weird. And it didn't matter anyway. Zev might be a little short and scrawny, but he had charisma. Enough to get professionally beautiful women like Angela Miller to flirt with him. Zev took in a breath. "Listen," he said. His voice was low, not quite a whisper, but quiet enough to make it obvious he didn't want anyone outside the room to be able to hear him. "You can't tell anyone what Val did to us." "What?" "Val killed people and put power into us," Zev said. "Angie told me she thought it was just a rumor, but sensitives, that's what people in the know usually call themselves, they tell stories about people killing each other for their powers. They call them vampires or cannibals. We definitely don't want anyone accusing us of being vampires." Zev paused, giving me a moment to process what he was saying. He waited for the confusion on my face to dissipate, and then went on before I had the chance to ask a question. "I don't think people would understand if we tried to explain," he said. "These stories, they say that you can't trust a vampire. Ever. Once a sensitive kills another sensitive and drinks their blood, they become addicted to it. They heal fast, and whatever gifts they had when they were human get a lot stronger. In these stories, they never stop killing people. Even if they want to, the only way to stop is to die." "But we never drank anyone's blood." "So some of the details are wrong," Zev said. "But, I feel different. I stubbed my toe the other day and it got better right away. And the doctor, he said you were a really fast healer, Elle. The fastest he'd ever seen. He said that you were going to get better in 3 days, but that a normal person with the sort of brain damage you had would have been permanently handicapped." I blinked at that. I had hurt my brain that badly? "Doberman told Reggie about how you jumped over cars that were being thrown at you," Zev continued. "They both think that your gift is just an all-around physical enhancement, and I think you'd better let them keep thinking that." "My gift?" I said. Zev opened his mouth to explain. "No, I think I get it," I said. "I just want to make sure I'm keeping it all straight. Sensitives have gifts. Vampires are sensitives who kill other sensitives." Zev nodded. "But what Val did to us wasn't our choice," I said. "Angie told me that there are a lot of stories about vampires who weren't trying to be monsters. The moral of every story, 0 tolerance. Never, ever spare the life of a vampire. Kill them on sight. No vampire ever manages to control themselves long term." Okay, I said. "But who tells these stories? Val was so worried about Angela trying to teach people to, to become sensitives? Val made it sound like immortals, vampires, will come and hunt down anyone they can find who is a sensitive." Angie thought vampires were a myth," Zev said. "I don't think they're very common, but people are kind of paranoid about gathering in large groups most of the time. One of the first things Doberman told me was the golden rule. A sensitive should avoid being alone for too long, but a group of sensitives should never, ever gather in a group larger than 12 or one will die." "How can vampires tell how large a group people gather in?" "Not vampires," Zev said. "The golden rule is to protect yourself from spooks. Things like that Weaver, the thing Val called an arachne demon." "There are more things like that? More spooks?" "From what Doberman said, they're usually not quite so strong or malevolent.
Zev said. But he said the Doberman Motel has to deal with a gremlin or a poltergeist at least twice a year. They're attracted to places where sensitives gather.
But only in groups of 13 or more?
Zev nodded. 13 is like ringing a dinner bell for the very worst monsters out there, he said, supposedly.
You're skeptical.
They also claim that it's safe to meet up for 3 days surrounding each equinox and solstice.
I frowned. So it's a bunch of superstition?
Zev shrugged. Well, obviously they've got some things right about vampires, he said, putting air quotes around the word with his fingers. What matters is that they believe it.
I nodded. All right, I said. So we keep anyone from finding out about us.
Which also means, if I ever get hurt, you have to keep me away from that doctor.
I nodded. If he realizes that you heal quickly in addition to talking to ghosts, it could be a problem.
Maybe for both of us, Zev said, looking pleased that I was catching on so quickly. And there's, one more thing. Angie wanted me to tell you, she knows it's not your fault, what happened.
Guilt twisted in me like a knife. I looked away from him. Was Zev telling the truth? Did Angela Miller really not blame me for what had happened to her? Maybe Doberman was right. He obviously knew more than Zev did, and he had dismissed what Zev was doing as just a conjuring. So maybe this ghost that Zev was calling up wasn't the real Angela at all. It could be a version of Angela Miller that was distorted through the way Zev had perceived her when she was alive. And Zev was my friend. He wouldn't want Angela to blame me for her death. So his conjuring didn't. I knew that Angela's death hadn't been my choice, that Val had used her power to force me to be there in the first place, that hers were the hands that had put out the light in Angela's eyes. That image, the moment that Angela Miller had died, it was going to haunt me for a long, long time, no matter what Zev claimed the woman's ghost had to say about it.
It really wasn't, Zev said quietly. Angie saw what happened. She knows who was pulling the strings.
I just kept looking down at the sheet that I was sitting on. Maybe, I said. Eventually, Zev and I got to talking about the text messages he had sent out, pretending to be me. I read over them and had to admit that he did a pretty good job at imagining the sort of things I would say. The text message thread with Lockwood did not look good. He told me to take care of my father and not to hurry back to work, and that when I got back, he was going to have to talk to me about restructuring the weeklies department. It sounded like I might be out of a job, at least unless I reconsidered whether I was willing to write glorified ads. Zev told me that he had been laid off outright, no severance. His position had just been part-time with no benefits, but it did not bode well for my own employment prospects. A knock at the door caused Zev to bolt upright and catapult off of the bed as he scrambled to go look through the glass viewer. When he got his eye up to the thing, he quickly relaxed and pulled open the door. It was Doberman holding out a fast food bag. He had 2 more clutched in his other hand. The sight of the fast food logo and the smell of greasy goodness made my mouth water.
"Hey kid," Doberman said, looking at me. "Got you a present."
I glanced from the food and then back to the man holding it. "Why do you keep calling me kid?" I asked.
"I figured you'd hate Princess."
"You know my name, don't you?"
"We ain't on a first-name basis, kid."
I snorted. "Guess not," I said. "Chief." Doberman walked over and set the bag on the bed next to me. I looked up at the big man, standing next to Zev. "Thanks for this," I said. "And, listen." Doberman grinned at me, an obnoxious grin that made me want to stop myself before saying what I was about to say to him. "I think I might owe you an apology," I said, "for how I was treating you before."
"Oh, kid, you getting sweet on me?"
I sighed. "Do you want me to hate you?" Doberman laughed.
"You do what you want,"
he said. I opened the bag and pulled out a sandwich that had been wrapped in tinfoil. I ripped open the foil to reveal a bacon cheeseburger. It smelled amazing. I took a bite. "Well," I said to Doberman, "I'll get out of your hair soon." "I think you should stay here," Doberman said, "least for a while." Free of charge," Doberman said. "I'm, not really comfortable with handouts," I said. "So come work for me." "Screw you! I mean cleaning hotel rooms," Doberman sighed. "Don't take this the wrong way, but you ain't a good fit for anything customer-facing." "He offers a pretty good deal," Zev said. I blinked at him. "I've been bartending," Zev said. "Minimum wage, but with a free room here. And Doberman thinks he'll smell Val coming if she comes back to town. It makes sense to keep close." "What if she sends another minion?" I said. I gestured to Doberman. Chief here didn't smell Chalmers coming until he was like 100 feet away. Zev frowned at that as he accepted his own grease-stained bag from Doberman. With a final fast food bag kept for himself, Doberman flopped down onto the chair next to the bed and pulled out a burger of his own. "I mean," Zev said, "do you have a better idea for a place to go?" I paused. "I guess I'll think about it," I said. Doberman shrugged. "You do that, kid." "Wait," I said. "What about all the damage in the parking lot Chalmers did?" "Insurance adjuster thinks a Hummer hit a bunch of parked cars," Doberman said. "Funny thing was, when he asked for the surveillance footage, that was exactly what they showed. Unmarked Hummer, no license plate. They're gonna pay out though, so it's cool." The insurance adjuster changed the surveillance camera video? "Straight-laced types can be pretty powerful at covering things up," Doberman said absently. The TV remote was still on the arm of the chair where he had left it. The big man grabbed it, and the TV sprang to life again. It was the same trashy show as before. Someone was yelling at someone else, with so many words bleeped that you couldn't even tell what was being said. The studio audience was hooting and cheering. "Can we not?" I said. Doberman tossed the remote over and it landed on the bed right next to me. Pretty accurate throw. "It's your room," Doberman said. I picked up the remote and looked around the room. It was small, but not smaller than the dorm room that I had been sharing with Mel, and it was a hell of a lot bigger than the back of the van. I glanced down at the remote and smiled. The chair and the wallpaper were both kind of ugly, but I'd never lived anywhere that had basic cable before, not to mention my own bathroom. I lifted the remote, pointed it at the television, and started flipping through the channels.
We hope you enjoyed this audiobook. If you'd like to support the creation of more stories about Eliza Cartwright, please share this story with a friend or leave us a review on Amazon, Audible, or Goodreads. Slug It is available as a paperback that functions as a very attractive doorstop, paperweight, or shelf decoration that you can look at while listening to more audiobooks. If you feel inclined to throw money into a tip jar, you can also do that using a link in the video description. Thanks for listening.
This has been Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Copyright 2020 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp. Production copyright 2021 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp.